now is probably a good time to actually start to look at your work. And what we're going to do is we're going to show, I believe, reel 6 of Brokeback Mountain. And again, you were nominated for an Academy Award and several awards for this film. So we're going to roll this reel. I think it's about 20 minutes, and then we'll come back and talk about that.
Okay.
So thanks.
That's good.
The script, the performances, the look of the film, does such an amazing movie. Maybe if you could talk a little bit about how you design your shots working with the actors, because a lot of that cinematography feels invisible. And then there's several, well not several, there's a few notable shots, tracking shots, that I think were really interesting when Enos receives the postcard and you don't see his reaction. And when they're having the argument out in the mountains. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how you design those shots and working with the actors.
Well, like we were talking before, it varies so much between one director and another. Ang Lee particularly is very specific about how he likes to design shots. Most of it with Ang is ideas that he comes up with either on the set after rehearsal or that he's preconceived. He doesn't come to the set with a storyboard or even a shot list. So most of the time we may have discussed general ideas about how we want to approach a scene, but not specific shots. So Ang will be the kind of director who will ask for a specific lens on a viewfinder, and he'll look through the viewfinder and it'll be marked, and he'll design the shot, which for me was a new thing. I wasn't used to that, and I must say that when I started working with him on Brokeback Mountain, it could be a little frustrating for me because you know, I'm used to designing the shots with a director and choosing the lens and things like that. But certainly Ang has an incredible eye and obviously very good taste, but also an incredible sense of storytelling, with a camera. So I went with it and learned to, from his design, then add a little bit of input, which was minimal because he had like a very set, things like, okay, let's use a 35mm lens, and I'd say, hey, how about a 40, so that whatever, so that the background isn't, and he'd then repeat, okay, so the 35mm lens. So finally I just gave up and okay, 35mm lens it is. But
how much rehearsing was some of that? Because it seems like the camera moves are so specific, where you're following the character and you're stopping in a certain place.
Yeah, well, the first thing, of course, would be to rehearse with the actors, and would stand there and look and look and look, and then and then he'd with the viewfinder, and then with the actors find the camera positions and maybe adjust the actors a little bit. But he's really specific, and more so on Lust Caution. And Brokeback he was, but on Lust Caution, it was incredible. It seemed almost like the way he even directed the actors, to me, seemed like animation. Well, we'll talk about Lust Caution when we get to that, because it was like every little detail. It's incredible the amount of detail. You can see it in Ang's movies. Everything. Everything is thought out and has a reason to be there, and obviously that includes the framing. And I operate the camera usually, so in Brokeback Mountain sometimes that was also awkward for me because he'd ask me to do things with the camera at very specific beats or moments. I'm so used to just going with my intuition, just moving the camera whenever it feels like it. But with Ang, sometimes I had to think. I had to be like, okay, when did he say? Oh, he said that when the eyebrow goes. Oh, that's when, things like that.
Cue.
Wow. Literally. So it was tricky, but he certainly communicates.
He knows
a
what he
lot.
wants.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So how much of the visual look did you bring to this, and what were your references? Because the look is amazing on this film.
Well, we certainly looked at a lot of references. For example, in this scene with the parents, Wilhelm Hammershore was this Dutch painter that inspired us, and it's the white walls and all that's completely inspired in his work. And so that was the reference. It's one of my favorite scenes in the movie visually. Just the starkness of it, and the just feels uncomfortable, you know, and just
very cold.
very cold, and I don't know. But I also the house was originally like this abandoned house that we found, and so we were able to practically make it, you know, and so again, everything is designed. Obviously, Andrew Wyeth, who's certainly a big influence. Photography, I use a lot of still photography in my references, and William Eggleston was certainly one of them for Brokeback Mountain. And we were going for simplicity. Also, for me, Brokeback Mountain was sort of an antidote to Alexander, which I had just finished with Oliver Stone, which was crazy. It was great. I loved it. I loved it, every second of it. But it was insane, you know, you know, armies and battles and all these actors and several cameras and just, you know, really complicated. So for me, it was such a
open space.
Yeah, relief to a simple story. So we approach it like that, as simple as possible. In the language of the camera, we also try to make it simple, because also the characters don't talk that much. Well, Jack talks a little more, but Ennis, his language is limited, let's say. He doesn't talk, so we wanted to do the same thing with the camera. We didn't want to do like an excess of shots or movement, or so. It's so simple that when there is a movement like that, like the one you're describing, going behind his back, and you see the phone booth behind him, and or when Ennis is in the Jake is in the foreground, Jake Gyllenhaal, and you see
rack focus.
Yeah, and the camera moves from one side of him to the other. Things like that become very important because the camera isn't moving for the rest of it. So that was, I think, an interesting approach.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like almost invisible, aside from those shots that like stuck out a little bit. But the camera work feels really invisible because I think the performances are just unfolding. What was it really challenging to work in that landscape, mountains, and the campfire scene? And
oh yeah, the campfire scene, that's also one of my favorites. That's supposed to be all dusk, obviously, as you see, but you certainly can't shoot a scene that long with all those dialogues at dusk. It's impossible. So I had to make it look like dusk in the middle of the day, and this was normal lab processing. There was no digital intermediate, so it had to be all in camera, and it just meant the way I figured it out was to use the fire as the anchor to make that, let's say, the source of light. So the firelight on the medium shots and the close-ups was extremely bright. I had like several 10Ks bouncing off this material that was slightly shimmering on their faces. And I covered them with just a black material on top to darken the ambient daylight. But had the exposure, so it had to be bright enough that it overpowered daylight, just ambient noon daylight. But then I put heavy neutral density on the lens so that the f-stop on the camera could be wide open, as if it would be in dusk. You know, you'd need to be wide open. So all those little things throughout the movie that was sort of the challenge, to make things seem, you know, like in that case it's dusk, and pull every trick out of the hat to make it not look like it's lit, or you know. So that was, I guess, my main challenge in the movie. And then certainly the weather and the changing lighting conditions. You see in the scene where they're discussing the, you know, the "I can't quit you" or "I wish I could quit you" scene. The clouds were coming in and out every second, and that's, I think, the worst enemy of cinematography. It just drives you insane because of continuity. And the scene has that, but you can see that some shots are cloudy, some have sun. You give up after. You know, what do? You can't. You know. So, but I think you don't really notice it much because what's happening is and what's happening is
such an intense moment.
Exactly. So then you know.
Yeah, I was wondering how you kept the peaks lit when it was a dark scene, like it was dusk. You know, I know you didn't have lights out there, but that explains it. Shooting.
Must go.
Yeah. Why don't we take a couple questions, and then we're going to have to continue moving on to another reel. Right here.
One of the things I loved about the movie when it came out was how, especially in the town, it so well conveyed that emotion of just isolation. It just felt desolate. And I was wondering if you could talk about how you and Aang sort of established that